Tocqueville lived in the first half of the 19th century. He was a French aristocrat. And when he was, I think, 25 years old, he came over to the United States to observe democracy in America, and then wrote a book with that title. And he made some pretty keen observations, which is what we've asked Dr. Deneen to talk about tonight. Dr. Deneen holds a BA in English Literature and PhD in Political Science from Rutgers University. From 1995 to 1997, he served as a speechwriter and special advisor to the director of the United States Information Agency. He's the author and editor of several books and numerous articles and reviews, as well as delivering invited lectures all around the country, as well as overseas. His research and teaching interests range from ancient and modern political thought to religion and politics. Some of his published works include The Odyssey of Political Theory and Redeeming Democracy in America. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Patrick Deneen.
I have the unabridged version of Tocqueville, so I need an extra stand. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you to Connor for making the connection. It's nice to be up here. I've heard a lot about this group, this gathering. I've heard a lot of great things about the Catholic community here in Grand Rapids, so I'm delighted to be here. And it was quite a while getting this scheduled, in part because I kept having things come up, and I actually tried to back out of this one too because my mom just got into town from the East Coast. But Mark pretty much insisted either this is it or you're never coming. So I'm here, Mark. The threat worked. My poor mom is weeping as we speak, alone at my home. No, she's fine. She'll play with the grandkids all night. I'm delighted to be here, and particularly to talk about, I think, the author that has most influenced my thinking, although I would include probably in that number, figures like Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Augustine, my colleague at Notre Dame, Alistair McIntyre. But I think it's Tocqueville, who I first read as a freshman in college, who helped me understand, among other things, why I loved where I grew up. I grew up in a small town just outside of Hartford, Connecticut, called Windsor, Connecticut, which lays claim to being the oldest town in the state of Connecticut. And I grew up in a town that was the quintessential New England town, the kind of town portrayed in the holiday favorite, It's a Wonderful Life. The town with a real downtown, walkable, mixed-use kinds of neighborhoods, tiny family-owned stores, front porches lining every elm tree-lined street, parks and places to go. As a kid growing up, you didn't need an automobile. And when I first read Tocqueville, who among other things praised life as he saw it when he came to the United States in New England towns, he helped me to articulate in a way philosophically why it was that I was so grateful and why I loved where I grew up. So I want to try to bring out some of what I think Tocqueville is so penetrating in his insights, in his analysis of his after his visit to the United States and his effort to tell his fellow Frenchmen what it was that he saw when he came to America, both its virtues but also the things that we should be concerned about. Now, the title of the talk tonight is Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville and Catholic Social Thought, but I think it's probably fair to say that that's maybe a little bit of an anachronism to some extent if we understand Catholic social thought having its origin, I think it's often dated to the late 19th century and the encyclical of Pope Leo XIII, De Rerum Novarum. Those of you who are familiar with that encyclical or the tradition of Catholic social teaching that traces itself through ever since that encyclical in 1891, are familiar with the basic premises of its argument, which is that what Leo XIII saw, what John Paul II saw, what Benedict XVI saw, what a whole series of insightful popes and thinkers within the Catholic tradition saw was that we were entering an age in which human beings were under the threat of, in some ways, having two unpalatable alternatives, one of which was a kind of reductionist individualism that didn't regard human beings as, in some ways, as fundamentally social, familial, communal creatures, and on the other hand, saw us and saw human beings as essentially creatures of the state, as being essentially, in some ways, having no individualism, as having, in some ways, only being creatures who belong to or ought to serve the state. And the long tradition of Catholic social teaching, beginning with De Rerum Novarum, articulates an alternative vision for human beings who are neither irreducible to their merely as radically atomistic individuals, but at the same time can't be thought of as merely species beings, to use Karl Marx's phrase, merely as creatures for some larger entity. And the long tradition of Catholic social thought identifies in particular and calls for Catholics to live in a world filled with robust social, familial, and communal relationships. That's the kind that I think you're, in some ways, living out through these kinds of events through your parish. Well, Tocqueville is writing before the development of this strain of Catholic social thought, and yet I think it could be argued that in some respects he writes about this phenomena avant la lettre. He's discerning these trends even before this becomes the official teaching of the Church, and he describes the dynamics that he expects to see arise out of what he discerns in its very incipient stages in democracy in America and what he perceives. Tocqueville lived, as Mark mentioned, in the early part of the 19th century. He didn't have a long life. He only lived 54 years, 1805 to 1859, and yet wrote what I think is still one of the most consequential studies of this democratic phenomenon. Perhaps what gave him his piercing insight was that he was born of a French aristocratic family, indeed a very significant French aristocratic family, which was first was given its landed estate, the estate of Tocqueville in the west of France, after the Battle of Hastings in 1066. So a very long-standing aristocratic family, 8 centuries by the time Tocqueville is born. He came of age in the aftermath of the French Revolution, and experienced that in many ways while he was born after the first outbreak of the revolution in 1789. Nevertheless, it touched his family very closely. Among other things, his maternal grandfather, the grandfather of his mother, was the defender of King Louis, pardon that, King Louis, I talk about the popes all the time, of King Louis, who not only failed in his defense, King Louis was executed, but then his maternal grandfather, the Duke or Earl of Malesherbes, was also executed. His father and his mother are both arrested as members of the aristocracy and were about to be executed when the most radical part of the revolution came to an end. But his father, as a result of being arrested, his hair turned white. And so every time Tocqueville saw his father, he was reminded of literally of the terror that he underwent. And probably his second best-known work is called The Old Regime and the French Revolution, which is a study of the excesses of the French Revolution. Tocqueville traveled to America for about 9 months in the early in 1830 to 1831. He was here, roughly, kind of academic year, you could say. Came in the fall and left in the spring. And he came officially on the behest of the French government to do research on the American penitentiary system, which, believe it or not, at that time was seen as more humane than, well, I guess it would be if you know anything about the Bastille, as more humane than the French system. But his real object was to study this phenomenon of democracy, this new phenomenon that seemed to be now taking the world by storm. He traveled up and down the East Coast, got to I think about as far north as Boston, and got down to slave territory. Visited with many significant people, including, of interest to Catholics, Charles Carroll, who was the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, and at that time the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence, whose cousin was John Carroll, who founded Georgetown University, where I taught before coming to Notre Dame. He also traveled into the wilderness, and he wrote a wonderful essay called My Journey into the Wilderness. And by wilderness, he meant this strange, wild place called Michigan. He traveled up through Detroit, which he writes about as a charming little village, believe it or not, through Pontiac, Saginaw, up the Upper Peninsula, and got up to Canada, and writes interesting things about Canadians. These journal entries that he writes about his time in Michigan are really striking because of what he describes experiencing there. I'm going to read you just one selection. This is the closest I could find to a description of that almost sounds like it could be Grand Rapids. It's Grand Bank, which is outside of Detroit, or was at the time. This is just drawn from his diary that he writes about his time in traveling through Michigan. Dinner at Grand Bank, a single shoesmith. We start out again at 7 o'clock. We enter a forest of huge oaks. The copse begins again. The road turns into a path hard to follow. Night comes on. Our anxiety at not being able to reach Flint River. The wind subsides. Deep tranquility. Deep darkness. Impressive silence of the woods disturbed by the sound of our horses and the cries of a single bird which seems to follow us. The full moon rises. Wonderful effects. Beneath the trees, plants silvered by the moon like the waves of the sea, withered trunks that seem black lying on the ground in the middle. Strange effects on the immense trunks of the oaks, huge columns of white marble. Moon through a withered wood on the edge of the clearing. A little lake seen between the hills under the trees. Very far off, the fires of an Indian camp. Icy coolness. That's just a little entry from his diary. I get the icy coolness part. I've been living in South Bend now for 2 winters. 5 years after his journey to America, he publishes the first volume of Democracy in America, followed 5 years later in 1835 is the first volume, 1840 is the second volume. The first volume is a sensation. It's reviewed everywhere, including a really very famous review by John Stuart Mill, considered to be perhaps the leading intellectual in the English-speaking world at the time. Volume 2 is perhaps less well-received, less celebrated, and yet it's Volume 2 that probably has his deepest thinking, his most philosophic thinking about democracy in America. He described Volume 1 as being more about America, and Volume 2 as being more about democracy and the phenomenon of democracy. And most of what I'll have to say about what Tocqueville has to say will actually be drawn from Volume 2. Well, he begins Democracy in America, so drawing on Volume 1, he begins Democracy in America with a pretty extraordinary introduction, the author's introduction, in which he writes that the birth of democracy, what he sees as the kind of coming into the world of democracy, arose as a result in particular of Christianity, of the incarnation of Christ. Before the incarnation, it was hard to conceive of human beings as being fundamentally equal in dignity and station. It seemed to be just the natural course, as Aristotle describes in his Politics, that we should differentiate human beings into different tribes and even into different ranks. And in much of the world until the beginning of Christianity regards certain humans as being inferior, as fundamentally inferior to other human beings. But with the beginning, or with the incarnation, Tocqueville suggests, one sees a kind of irresistible tide, a kind of dynamic within history that leads inexorably, step after step, to the eventual insufferableness of any political system that doesn't recognize the fundamental equality of all human beings. He talks about it as a providential force, almost as if, he suggests, as if it's as inevitable as the stars that move in their tracks in the sky. He talks about God's hand being underneath and underlying the development of democracy in the world. And in this extraordinary set of pages, about 10 pages, in which he describes this as this providential fact, as this march through history, as almost an inevitability, he concludes by saying that seeing, and I quote, this irresistible revolution that for so many centuries has marched over all obstacles and that still advances today amid the ruins it has made, that it fills him with what he describes, and I quote, with a religious terror. That the providential fact that seems to be an inevitability, that God ordains, fills him with une terreur religieuse. And this is a man who does not use the word terror lightly. He's seen it. He's seen what it's done to his family. Well, how can this be then? How can the providential fact of democracy fill him with a kind of religious terror? It's not, I think, because there's something wrong with identifying and recognizing the fundamental dignity and equality of all human beings. It's the tendency, I think, that he sees of any political system to develop internally to a kind of extreme of its own self, to turn into an extreme of its own self and in some ways betray itself in becoming an extreme version of itself. In Volume 2 of Democracy in America, he describes two fundamental impulses within democracy that I think explain why he's filled with a religious terror when he regards the development, or what he sees as the likely development of democracy. The first of these is born of the basic commitments of democracy. The basic commitment of democracy, he says, and this is part of his observation of coming to America, is what he calls the equality of conditions. He comes to America in the 1830s and says, everywhere I turned, I saw people committed to the equality of conditions. Now that has to seem like an absurd claim being made in the 1830s, right? I mean, first of all, slavery exists. There's pretty severe social stratification as we have today. Why would he claim that there's something called the equality of conditions? Well, by this phrase, he doesn't mean everyone was the same. What he means by this term equality of conditions is that when he comes to America, the differences, the manifest differences that seem to mark all human beings in all times and all places, some born rich, some born poor, some born into a condition of social elite status, and some not. Whereas every human civilization that seems ever to have existed regards that as a matter of fate and nature, he says in America, it's not accepted as an inevitability. No one born into any station necessarily has to stay in that position. And no one born in a station that could be seen as lesser than anyone else is seen as in any way less than fundamentally human. Of course, we can make an exception for the slaves at this time, but Tocqueville, even in a chapter devoted to the question of slavery in America, suggests that the indigestibility of this fact within America will ultimately have to be resolved. It can't be maintained. It's a lie within the democratic system. So that there's no fundamental value, we could say, given to somebody who's in a different position, born into a different position of life. There's no fundamental inevitability, naturalness, or we could say a kind of moral significance given to that difference of that position. Now remember where Tocqueville's coming from. He's an aristocrat from aristocratic France. The people you're born to determine who you are. They determine how you are perceived, what your name is, what house you're from, what status you have, is who you are. He comes to America and he sees a place, he meets Charles Carroll, one of the most elite, from the most elite and wealthy families in America, and Carroll tells him, well, I'm just an American. Right? I'm just a citizen of America like anyone else. Right? So already this egalitarian sense is very strong in America. And Tocqueville admires this on the one hand, but he says there's a kernel, there's a seed in this that he thinks will lead inevitably to a kind of leveling. Equality as a kind of leveling, and ultimately that it may turn into a kind of homogenization of society, a kind of standardization and a flattening of the moral and lived experience of people in a democratic society. The second feature of democracy that he notes is a kind of proud independence, right, starting with our Declaration of Independence. The status of being free. And of course, this is a feature of this idea of equality of conditions. We are not born to anyone else's fate. Who I am is not attached or in some ways reliant upon someone else's status or position. This gives us a strong sense of independence, gives people in a democratic society a strong sense of their own selfhood. But he says also this has a very powerful kernel or seed that can develop into something really quite dangerous. And so in the 2 volumes of Democracy in America, the first volume in particular, you could say he praises many of these features. He says it's a wonderful thing to see how this manifests itself politically, and he admires especially the political engagement that he sees in the New England towns. But in volume 2, he begins to speculate, what might we see that could be danger signs for democracy and for democracy in America? Well, I'll just flesh these out a little bit. In the first place, equality, as he begins talking about this with this idea of equality of conditions, of course, is a fundamental aspect and obligation of democracy, and he thinks will lead to a kind of rejection of all forms of aristocratic vestige in America. Right? That in particular, this egalitarian sense will lead to the rejection of anything that smacks of an aristocratic sensibility, or even a kind of inheritance from aristocratic times. I think we see this, for example, I've spent most of my adult life now within the university setting, and it's always a wonder to my students to explain to them that there used to be something called a gentleman's C. People who out there who are old enough will recognize this phrase, gentleman's C. My students have never heard of this. They can't even conceive that there's anything called a gentleman, much less anyone, such human being that would want a C. And I explained to them that in a time before they were born, many of the young men, and these were most cases men who would attend universities, were born of families whose status was more or less given. They were kind of an American aristocracy. And we think of, somebody like George W. Bush, or the Bush family as an example of this. He got execrable grades as a prep school student, and he got pretty execrable grades as a student at Yale. He's the embodiment of the gentleman's C. Now, by the time he comes into the public gaze as a presidential candidate, people regard his GPA as a kind of sign of his idiocy. But he was a member of the kind of old American aristocracy, where it was a kind of signal of a certain kind of bad taste to strive for grades. You didn't have to strive for grades. You were who you were. You were a Bush. You remember the Bush family of Connecticut. You didn't have to strive for grades, and it would be unseemly to try to get more than a C. So the gentleman's C is a kind of vestige of an aristocratic age in which your position, your membership in places like Andover and Yale was a result of who you were born to. But this was a vestige of an aristocratic age, of course, that is now unbearable to us. And increasingly, I think it's the case, almost universally, we regard any vestige of this as objectionable, and we expect admissions to our status-conferring institutions like universities to be done on a meritocratic basis, not an aristocratic basis, to be based on your accomplishments, not who you're born to. The SAT is created so that we are no longer going to look at your name, we're just going to look at this number that just appears out of the ether. Right? It's not who you're born to, it's not where you come from. Right? We're no longer going to take those into account. We could say that most American institutions have been transformed under this democratic egalitarian impulse. Most of our institutions, if they had vestiges of an aristocratic past, have been remade. Now, this is, on the one hand, you could say a good thing. But Tocqueville worries about this. He says, look, there are certain features of an aristocratic society that may be praiseworthy, that democracies won't particularly like. One phrase that he says over and over again that I'm always drawn to is he says, democracies will have a distaste for forms. They won't like forms. So what is that? They don't like to make cakes? The ladies in the audience might get that. What is it about forms they don't like? Well, he means by forms anything with a kind of shape. Right? What's a form? A form, conveniently can get a drink now. This is a form. right? If I didn't have this particular form, this water would be, at the moment, all over me. Instead of conveniently now being able to pour it into my gullet. A form, right, holds certain things in and keeps certain things out. A form is a shape, and it has a certain set of features to it that give it its dimensions and its distinctions. Now, is Tocqueville suggesting we won't like cups? Well, in a certain sense, maybe. What he says is that democracies will bridle against forms to the extent that they separate. What does a form do? It gives shape to something, and something is inside and something is outside. Right? Something is contained and something is not contained. But what are ways in which democracies won't like forms? Well, we might say one way in which we'll see this is that it won't like formality. It won't like certain formalities. For example, we won't like the kinds of distinctions that aristocracies make. And one of the things the Constitution says right away in its Article 1, in its description of what Congress can and can't do, is that there will be no titles. Democracies don't like titles, because titles are a kind of formality. They distinguish certain people from others. We won't have knights running around. We won't have certain lords running around. Right? We won't be an aristocratic society. But notice how this distrust of titles filters itself down within a democratic society in ways we don't even notice. Now, many of you of a certain age will probably at least remember a time when growing up when everyone who was above a certain age would be called Mr. and Mrs. And then a last name would follow. But I'll bet for most of your children, that's probably a bit of a strange phenomenon, unless you've been teaching them in a certain way, but you'll notice you're countercultural if you're trying to do that. Right? For most kids growing up these days, if they use the Mr. and Miss or Ms. titles at all, it will be Ms. Sue or Ms. Tim, or there's Father John or Father Bill, maybe someday Father Sue, I don't know. No, we won't go there. All right? There's a distrust of formalities because it's something that separates us. Right? There's an increasing tendency within universities of students having a distaste of calling their professors professor. I get emails sometimes, "Dear Pat," or just "Pat." And I will write back to them and remind them that I have a PhD. They can call me doctor. Okay? There's a kind of there's a mistrust of formalities. We have these official forms of informality now. You know, dress down Fridays, or increasingly dress up Mondays. You know, every day of the week is dress down. A kind of distaste for something that separates us from other people, something that distinguishes us from other people. There's a mistrust of forms, you could say, in the ways in which they can create separations of people. So if one tries to distinguish oneself from other people, for example, through different kinds of communities, different kinds of particular ways of life, there's an increasing mistrust of those kinds of forms. Right? What are those people doing over there? And we could say that there's a strong tendency toward a kind of homogenization of American society. There's a mistrust of hierarchy, of course. Right? Anyone who's seen as higher or lower. And one of the most fascinating parts of democracy in America is when Tocqueville talks about the religious tendencies that he thinks will be likely in a democracy. He says the mistrust of formality and forms will first of all be manifest in liturgy. Right? We'll want informal liturgy. And indeed will become mistrustful of any liturgy of any kind. Indeed, he has a section, entire chapter devoted to the likelihood that Americans will become much more pantheistic than members of an organized religion. I think it's a harbinger of that phrase I hear on almost every young person's lips today. I'm spiritual, but not religious. Right? I don't belong to any formal form of religion. I have a kind of informal relationship to God. But the ultimate expression of this is this idea of pantheism, in which we find the idea of a God up there, offensive to our sensibilities, our egalitarian sensibilities, and rather we'll think of God as being everywhere, and in everyone, and in everything. Pantheism is divinity everywhere, where there's no longer any division between God and the world. There is no city of God and no city of man. God is everywhere, and everywhere we are gods. Tocqueville then suggests that the egalitarian impulse will eventually level all of human life in certain ways, where it's both justified, when we should not be regarding certain human beings as less than human, but also where it's not justified, where certain people who might be deserving of greater respect can't be accorded that respect, or perhaps a respect and ultimately a fear of the divine also should be leveled and brought down to the level of a kind of pantheistic equality. The impulse toward independence, also admirable in many respects, can also has the seeds of a kind of self-destructive tendency, he describes. There's a strong belief in our capacity to make ourselves. And this is admirable, he says, because democratic peoples, right, don't simply rely on other people to do things for them. He's amazed when he comes to America and he sees, particularly in the New England townships, the energy of American citizens in getting up and doing things on their own and not just sitting back and waiting for someone else to fill the pothole or build the building that needs to be built or solve the problem that needs to be solved. But he thinks there's a tendency here again that sort of left to its own devices will lead to a kind of self-destructive conclusion. In one of his more, I think, rightly famous chapters, it's a chapter on in which he describes the rise of something unique that he thinks is likely in America. He speaks of, in this chapter, in Volume 2, of the rise of individualism that he thinks will become a hallmark of democratic societies. This is what he describes. In democratic peoples, new families constantly issue from nothing. Others constantly fall into it, and all those who stay on change face. The fabric of time is torn at every moment, and the trace of generations is effaced. You easily forget all those who preceded you, and you have no idea of those who will follow you. Only those nearest to you have an interest. Aristocracy made of all citizens a long chain that went up from the peasant to the king. Democracy breaks that chain and sets every man apart. Thus, not only does democracy make each man forget his ancestors, but it hides his descendants from him and separates him from his contemporaries. It constantly leads him back toward himself alone and threatens finally to confine him wholly to the solitude of his own heart. What Tocqueville is describing here is individualism isn't what we might think of as a kind of strong sense of who I am, but this distinction between aristocracy and democracy in particular, that we, members of democracy, will have a tendency to define who we are entirely in terms of our own efforts and entirely in terms of our own activities. We won't see the ways in which we are reliant upon and connected to other human beings, starting with our families, but also extending out to our communities and beyond. Now, this is, on the one hand, he thinks there are certain ways in which this is a gain, because aristocracies define themselves too much, perhaps, in terms of their relationships to their ancestors. But democracies, he feared, would have a tendency to define, or the people within a democracy would have a tendency to define themselves wholly in terms of themselves alone, losing the sense of connection to others, and inevitably, in some ways, actually understating how much they relied upon the work and effort of others who had preceded them and who would follow them. This tendency filled democratic peoples, he said, with a particular quality that he found to be remarkable in his visit to America and thinking about it. This is, again, one of his most famous chapters in Volume 2. He writes of the extraordinary restlessness of Americans. And so imagine coming from an aristocratic world, who you are is defined by who you're born to. What you will do, in the case of most British people, is defined by your name. Do you have any Smiths here? That's your profession. Any Millers here? These are Anglo-Saxon names. Maybe we have more O'Shaughnessy's here or something. Smith, Miller, Weaver, Taylor. Go through all the classic British names. These aren't just names, these are what you do. Who you are is who your parents are, and who you are is what your parents did. It doesn't matter how hard you work. If I work really hard as being a tailor, I might get promoted to a smith. Right? That's not how it works. You don't get to change your name. This is the great conceit of one of the great movies about this, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Right? Those of you who know this movie, there's a famous scene with a couple of peasants digging in a ditch, piling mud up, and King Arthur comes along and asks them what they're doing, and he discovers that they're actually an anarchist democratic commune who don't recognize his legitimacy as king because, as one of the peasants says, just because a watery tart throws a scimitar at you doesn't make you supreme ruler. Well, this is really funny because, of course, this is not something that a peasant would really think of. The peasant accepts that he or she is a peasant because that's where you're born. Well, in America, when Tocqueville comes, he finds a people who are obsessed by what they don't have. If aristocratic societies are defined by a kind of quiescence and a state of acceptance, I'm born a peasant, I'll live a peasant, I'll die a peasant. Americans are driven because of what we don't have, because of what we're not yet, because of what might still be possible. An extraordinary set of passages in a chapter on restlessness in America. Tocqueville writes in ways that are, anyway, strikingly prescient about the kind of people that he sees. It is a strange thing to see with what sort of feverish ardor Americans pursue well-being, and how they show themselves to be constantly tormented by a vague fear of not having chosen the shortest route that can lead to it. In the United States, a man carefully builds a dwelling in which to pass his declining years, and he sells it while the roof is being laid. This is Flip That House. He plants a garden, and he rents it out just as he was going to taste its fruits. He clears a field and leaves to others the care of harvesting its crops. He embraces a profession, and just as quickly he quits it. In a social state in which the law or custom no longer keeps anyone in his place, when this is joined to a taste for material well-being, he continues, this greatly excites restlessness of spirit. One will then see men change course continuously for missing the shortest road that would lead them to happiness. What Tocqueville describes is really extraordinary in these set of passages, a kind of institutionalized discontent. As soon as you get something, you're looking immediately for what's around the next corner. As soon as you go somewhere, you're thinking immediately, where do I have to be next? As soon as I get the thing I wanted, I'm immediately gnawed at by the thing I don't yet have. There's a kind of constant comparison both with others, but also a dissatisfaction even when one is at the top, arguably, even when one has gotten the brass ring in front of everyone else. This tendency, I think, informs then what he sees as the American proclivity, especially to something that we might today call the ideology of progress or progressivism. That there's always something that must be done to change or perfect our condition. He says what's remarkable in America is that while it's been the case that there have been people throughout history that have had dreams of a perfect society, Plato's Republic or Thomas More's Utopia, he's never been to a place where the entire country was utopian. Right? The entire country believed in the possibility of creating the kingdom of God on earth, which becomes, within a few decades, the mantra of particularly liberal Protestant thought, and I think underlies contemporary orientation toward a kind of utopianism within our political world. These conditions or these tendencies within democracy, equality on the one hand leading to a kind of leveling, and independence leading to a kind of radical form of individualism and a belief in a kind of autonomy, combined, Tocqueville finally concludes at the end of Democracy in America, in a very dangerous mix in which he believes and fears that democracy will ultimately tend toward its own self-destruction. And in a particular way, that democracy will become oriented toward its own negation in the name of democracy. That a democratic people will crave for a kind of despotism, he says. Despotism in the history of the world has always been the imposition of the will of one or a few people over the mass of humanity. This is the classical definition of the word despotism one finds in Plato, the classical political philosophy. Despotism is the imposition of the will of one or few on the many, against their will. What Tocqueville says, I'm trying to imagine how to describe this phenomena that I see possibly aborting in the world, and I don't have a good word for it because the word despotism doesn't exactly describe it, because it's not going to be something imposed on a democratic people. They're going to ask for it. They're going to invite it. Because on the one hand, they will be radically individuated selves. They will have shorn themselves of all of those bonds and relationships that they have, in their desire to escape from their aristocratic past, they will see as the form of their liberation. They will be individuals. They will be self-standing, purely autonomous human beings. But in their demand for equality, they will turn to the one source that can give them that equality, which becomes the state. It can ensure equality because it can make a homogeneous system that will apply equally to every human being. No more differentiation, no more particularity. A leveled society of radically individuated selves. This, he says, is the origins of what he says as possibly the coming into the world of something he describes as democratic despotism. Not now the imposition of the state over the people, but the people's willing invitation to be ruled by what he calls a tutelary state, a soft state that will, through gentle rules and regulations and a kind of growing set of norms, regulate all of the affairs of these radically individuated selves. This was written in 1840, Tocqueville describes. So he concludes the book there. It's kind of depressing. But throughout the course of the book, he also describes ways that perhaps a democratic society might survive. And we might say that what he in particular commends is, to the extent possible, retain the forms. Retain the forms. Retain the family. Retain the community. Retain life in associations. Retain God as separate from, not strange, not estranged, but as distinct, as horizontal in his relationship with humanity. Retain the formalities that will become insufferable to a democratic peoples. And oddly enough, that aspect that can be in some ways seen as against the grain of the democratic tendency will allow democracy to flourish. Retain and embolden and strengthen broadly a civil society, the sphere of life that is neither defined simply by our individual autonomy or by the state, the place where we do things together in order to achieve solutions and ends that we can only attain together, and democracy has a chance of survival. So it's a pretty grim picture, I think, that he paints about the tendencies of democracy, and by my reading, he seems to be getting more right every day. But I think his commendations also are just as right now as when he made them then. And the question then is put into the hands of all of us. What can we do to maintain the possibility of democracy in America? Thanks very much. Did you take here? Sure.
Yeah, we do. We do. I just want to say thank you to Dr. Deneen for his lecture. So I'm sitting back there, I guess the question I'm wondering is, who retains it? It's maybe a philosophical question on democracy, but I don't know. It's going to be some good discussions over wine later. But I want to leave some of those questions to some of you. I'm sure they're out there and we'd love to hear them, and we'll move around with the microphone. Let's do about 5 or 6 or so, or okay. Just raise your hand and we'll get the mic.
It's been a while since I've read in Democracy in America, but after listening to your presentation, I'm wondering how realistic a vision of a radically egalitarian America really was in those days. I mean, I'm thinking about Southern plantation owners, for example. Aristocracy is rooted in wealth, not in tastes or manners or refined sensibilities. You do have the new rich emerging in America, and there's a very real sense in which you can distinguish an aristocratic class from the masses.
Do you want me to answer each one or take several?
Go ahead.
Okay, it's a great question. So first of all, and as I try to suggest, Tocqueville does not neglect or ignore the fact that there is inequality in the America that he sees. And as I mentioned, there's probably the longest chapter. I think the longest chapter in Democracy in America is the last chapter of Volume 1, which is devoted to the question of blacks and Indians in America. And he's really very severe on the Americans on both counts, very severe. But as I also mentioned, he believes that slavery the slavery question will come to a head. This is 1830, so there's still kind of, not certainty how this is going to play out. But he thinks this is fundamentally a contradiction within America that will have to be resolved. And if democracy is going to be true to itself, it will resolve it in the direction of the elimination of slavery as an official matter. He does go on to predict that once slavery is abolished, the liberation of African Americans is going to be a continual problem for Americans, because the enslavement of Africans was a particularly egregious form of enslavement that was premised upon almost the direct contradiction of everything I had to say about equality. Right? That even in ancient slavery was not premised on the idea that these people were subhuman. It was usually, we beat you guys in a war and we get to enslave you now. But once you're freed, you're like us. Right? So Tocqueville says that the liberation of the African slaves will become a constant and almost irresolvable problem for Americans for the rest of their history, which again strikes me as pretty prescient. But what he does say is that notwithstanding the treatment of African slaves and Indians, which are obviously is major exceptions, this premise of equality of condition reigns supreme even between those who are wealthy and those who are poor. Now, I would agree with you that in aristocratic societies, you could say that they're based on wealth, but the difference of wealth between your wealthiest king in the Middle Ages and the poorest serf can't even begin to hold a candle to the difference of wealth between the poorest person in the United States today and the richest person in the United States today. So I'm not disputing that wealth doesn't have something to do with that, but you're an aristocrat no matter what your wealth and what your position is. Now, obviously, there are often privileges that come with that. Often it's land, it is economic, but it's not only that. What Tocqueville, one of the things that's really striking about his analysis, and I think these sections of his argument are going to become much more into the fore, is what he predicts will be the unfolding of a new kind of actual inequality within democracy. And it will be a different kind of inequality than that within an aristocracy. The difference in an aristocracy is that if you happen to get born a duke or an earl or a king, you have a different status than a serf, but that's true only as far as it goes. And there's a way in which there but for the grace of God go I. And he says, for this reason, and I don't want to romanticize this, but for this reason, there was something in aristocratic society called noblesse oblige, right? The idea that to some extent, the aristocracy had a kind of duty and a requirement to watch out for, and in some ways be involved in the destinies of those who were in some ways under their charge. And this is part of the idea behind feudalism, is that there's respective duties and obligations between the aristocrats and the feudal classes. What he says is that in the new American, or in the new democratic system, there will be stratification. There will be actually much more extreme forms of economic stratification, because in a dynamic economic system, unlike aristocracy, some people are going to win really big in the economic stakes, and some aren't. It's not going to be just inherited wealth that just kind of stays the same generation after generation. Some will rise and some will fall. The difference, he argues, is there will be no more noblesse oblige. He has a remarkable chapter in which he describes the relationship between the new lords within the democratic society, the industrial class, he describes it, it's sort of just proto-industrial revolution, and the working class, in which he says these people will no longer even live near each other. They will be completely separated geographically. Their fates will in no way touch each other. They will have no sense in which there is any bond or relationship between them. Some will work for others, but that will be only as far as the relationship goes. And if one follows and looks at some of the most recent data and findings from some, I think, really interesting work that's been done recently, among others, people like Charles Murray, who's written a book called Coming Apart, who's analyzed the kind of settlement patterns within the United States today. What we're finding is an extraordinary form of geographic sifting that has never existed in American history before, in which the wealthy and successful are all settling in about 6 cities in the United States. I got away from one of them, like Connor here. We got out of Washington, D.C., which Washington, D.C. is now 7 of the 10 wealthiest counties in the country. What is it they produce again? I forget. Lawyers, yeah, I know. At any rate, but one of the things that seems to me that Tocqueville is anticipating is a society which will actually, in the name of equality, in the liberation that equality will allow, will actually become one of the most perfectly inegalitarian societies that has ever existed. And that, again, seems to me to be pretty accurate. Thank you.
First of all, very well spoken, excellent presentation. This guy seems very insightful.
He was.
My question,
you can make a career just riding on the tailcoat of Alexis de Tocqueville, and you end up sounding really brilliant.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
I can recommend it.
My question goes back to, I particularly like the point about forms and formality.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there is a real, not only a significance to it, but also an inherent desire that I've seen amongst people in society and just generally with the dissatisfaction of the lack of form and this inherent desire for it. I think the hesitation for some people is that extreme version of a formality that turns into more of a dictatorial state, or something where it turns from a formality and a mere honoring of position or honoring of reward to an actual hard tyranny, if you will. What would your suggestion be in terms of returning to a formality or returning some of these forms in American society without it evolving radically into this kind of tyranny or this dictatorial state, if you will?
Yeah, that's good. That's a good question. I would say in the first instance, we should think about forms and formality, and this is going to sound contradictory in some ways, from the bottom up rather than from the top down in some ways. And I mean this in some ways as a practical piece of advice for young, relatively young person like yourself and those who are here who are raising kids or involved in their lives of grandkids, which is teach your kids formality, teach your kids the forms. Right. I'm sure Father won't mind if I suggest maybe dress up when you have them come to church. You're good with that. Father gives us thumbs up. Dress up when you come to church. Get your children, as hard as it is, scrub their faces, brush their teeth, put on some nice clothes, wear something like this once in a while. Engage in the formalities. All right. One of the hardest things that I think any parent encounters is teaching your kids table manners. Why do we do it? Why Do we try to teach our kids to eat rice with a fork? Or get them not to just bulldoze food into their mouths? Oh, this is a fork. Why do we do that? Why do we put ourselves through this pain and agony? Well, I think there are really good reasons. It's actually one of my pet projects is actually to look into the past of manners, and among them table manners. I think it's a really fascinating topic. Where did these things come about? Why did they come into existence? And it's pretty clear that one of the things that eating with utensils does is that it doesn't necessarily speed up eating. In fact, it slows it down. And you can eat a lot faster. I mean, I realize if it's hot, you might want to have something to hold on to it. But it's much faster to eat without utensils. And my kids get this, right? I mean, throw it into your face, right? My dog gets this, right? Intuitively, I think my kids know it's much easier to eat without these implements. So why do we do it? Well, if you look back into the kind of ancient history of utensils and using the fork and the knife in the case of the West, it has everything in some ways to do with A, slowing us down, and B, forcing us to bring the food to our face rather than bringing our face to the food. So it has something to do with the upright form of the human being. It has something to do with combining nature and convention in a very Aristotelian way, right? Cultivating a certain kind of way in which our natural appetite can in some ways be combined with the convention of how it is we fulfill that appetite. So that one of the things that table manners do is slow us down, force us to be upright. In other words, prepare us to engage in something called conversation, right? Or communion, put it in those terms, right? A coming together of human beings that's not only about, as quickly as possible, fulfilling our appetites, but engaging in something of a form of community. Another way in which we could say these forms exist or once existed was in something called dating and courtship. And if you think about it, it's also about fulfilling our appetites in a way that slows us down. Right? There's a way to fulfill your appetite when it comes to eating as quickly as possible, which is go to McDonald's and don't even ever see a fork. And there's a way to fulfill your appetite when it comes to sexuality as quickly as possible, which is go to the version of McDonald's called a college dorm and fulfill your appetite as quickly as possible. Right? But you could say in both these respects, the forms are ways that we tame our appetite. We slow our natural inclinations down through a training, through certain conventions that allow us to become more fully human, arguably. We're most fully human when we're not simply subject to our appetites. So the forms and formalities are ways that we actually attain a kind of the best form of our humanity. Now, if you think about American society today, I've mentioned we don't like to use the honorifics anymore, Mr. and Mrs. You could also say one of the hallmarks of American society today is we don't like table manners. You can think about every food type, or let me put it this way. What is the American contribution to world cuisine? Okay, I know New Orleans is out there, and clam chowder. But aside from certain of those regional specialties, the American contribution to world cuisine is to take every possible food type of every civilization and to make it edible without a fork and a knife. If you go to Italy, you'll be shocked to see that they eat pizza with a fork and a knife. Right? Nearly every civilization has figured out chopsticks or whatever it is that you want to talk about. But what Americans have figured out is how to eat every form of food without a fork and a knife. And we actually now have built this into our automobiles so that we can have 6-course meals in our automobiles essentially, so we can fill our tanks as quickly as possible. So when it comes to eating, we have devised ways that we can consume as quickly as possible to fulfill our appetites. And the same thing is true with sexuality. I talk to my college students all the time. Does anyone date anymore? And even at Notre Dame, great Catholic university, we don't date. Dating is so last century, right? There's no courtship, right? We hook up. Right? I didn't want to get into what that means, right? But it seems to me that when we talk about forms and formality, we can talk about it in some ways from bottom up. How do we raise our children? How do we create a culture? How do we cultivate a culture with forms? So I recognize, when you hear forms, you might think, oh, we want some kind of, somebody who's going to dictate this from the top down. But it seems to me that if, in the various places in America that still care about these things, to do this from the bottom up would be an enormous contribution to a culture of forms in America. You want to follow up on that? Yeah. Sure. Well, yeah, I think that, and I think Tocqueville really is entirely aware of this. Look, what Tocqueville recognized that aristocratic societies were unjust because they had forms for everything, even where they shouldn't have had forms. Right? There was a title or a designation for everything, even where there was no actual entitlement that was owing or due to that person. Right? So Tocqueville says, democracies are more just because democracies recognize merit where merit is due. But democracies will have a tendency to become equally unjust because the egalitarian impulse will lead them not to want to accord just due where it should be recognized out of an undue regard for a kind of leveling impulse. So the question for Tocqueville, how does democracy retain the capacity not to go to the other extreme, which is exemplified within aristocracy? Right. I think I'm fascinated by the movie genre of American schlubs who discover that they're royalty. There's an entire genre out there of like King Ralph, right? John Goodman discovers he's like the prince of something, and the first thing that you discover is that when John Goodman or the Princess Diaries or whatever the movie is, when they go over to England or the unnamed country in Eastern Europe, they discover that these people have a stick up their you-know-what. They're so aristocratic, they just can't be loose and cool like Americans. And almost inevitably in the story, the happy ending involves the American teaching these people how to be cool and with it and no longer stick, that the Americans teach them a kind of informality, which usually involves them eating, with their fingers, and I think one of them involves Julie Andrews' mattress sliding down Buckingham Palace stairs. Right. So the typical American answer is not how do we learn from these aristocratic societies, but how do we teach them? How do we export our informality? And it's an extraordinary genre because it's one of the most popular ways to portray the American kind of contribution to the world, which is, how to eat everything with your fingers.
Professor?
Yes.
Thank you for your remarks. My question has to do with the observation of de Tocqueville concerning Americans' almost unique creating of voluntary associations, which I think is probably still true today. We, more than anybody else on the face of the earth, create societies and associations and parties. How does that fit into his thesis? He said that this is a consequence of the individual feeling powerless in a democracy. Is this a good thing from his point of view? Does this help democracy flourish, or does it accelerate these bad tendencies? Thank you.
Sure. Again, a great question. You've clearly read your Tocqueville. You know one of the main points and arguments that he makes. In fact, he recognizes and acknowledges and argues that what he sees again in America, and this is especially in Volume 1, but he also talks about this in Volume 2, one of the extraordinary things he sees in America is this willingness and ability to form associations, to form various groups, and through these kinds of associations, do things together, get things done. And he compares this continuously to life in aristocratic France, where when something is gone wrong, either it will stay wrong forever, or maybe some member of the government will come and take care of it. Right? And he's talking here in particular about a society, comparing a society which is highly decentralized in America. And why he admires the townships in America, the New England townships, is that the American townships are kind of, he sees them as the most important political units in America. He says the states aren't even that important. And the federal government, nobody even knows what's going on there. It was the 1830s, right? It's kind of far away. That if you want to get anything done, you do it through local institutions, associations, townships, etc. Whereas in France, because there's a kind of sense that, well, there's not much we can do, we have to rely upon the central government to do it, either it gets done by the central government or not at all. So he in fact regards the flourishing of associations as a signal of health, extraordinary health of American democracy. And he argues throughout democracy in America that to the extent that you have a vibrant associational life, you can expect to have a healthy democracy. And I think you're right to the extent that America is still much more probably compared to any other society in the world, is a society that still is in many ways defined by an extraordinary kind of form of voluntarism, right? Often located within local settings, communities, churches, etc. But in the political science world, in the empirical sort of sociology and political science world, it's been a worrying sign that an awful lot of data by which we measure these kinds of phenomena shows that there has been a steep and continuous decline of associational life in America, roughly since the 1960s until today. That while it's still relatively vital and vibrant in comparison to most societies, where many of those societies didn't have that tradition, what we're seeing is a couple of things. First of all, just an increasing decline, work by Robert Putnam at Harvard University. Some of you may know his work, captured, I think, aptly in the title of an article and then a book called Bowling Alone, in which he described the phenomena that the empirical data that showed that as many people were bowling when he wrote this article in 1995 and then the book in 2000, as many people were bowling then as were bowling in the 1960s. It was just they weren't bowling in bowling leagues anymore. So people were now bowling alone. And then he went on to show how this was true across a whole set of kinds of phenomena, PTAs, men's clubs of various kinds, women's clubs of various kinds, all kinds of political activity were declining. Just the other day in class, I showed my students the findings from this past year's 2014's Millennial report from the Pew Foundation. This was a study of various commitments and forms of engagement among people 18 to 32 years old as compared to the four sort of existing generations, the Millennial generation, the youngest, the Generation X, sort of 30 to 50, the baby boom generation, 50 to 65, and then what they call the silent generation, people who are quiet, sort of the greatest generation of World War II, those who fought in World War II. And what's extraordinary about this data is that it shows a continuous decline across a set of measures, including what is your likelihood of participating in a form of a voluntary association, decreasing through the generations. What is your likelihood of identifying with a political party? Decreasing throughout the generations. What is your level of trust for other Americans? Decreasing. 20% in the Millennial generation expressed trust toward their fellow Americans. What is your likelihood of being participating or having a membership in a religious within a religious order or church? Lowest levels among the Millennial generation, only about 50%, but depending on what data you look at, dropping. What's the likelihood of your being married by the age of 30? And what's interesting is, the silent generation, 60% were married by the age, or maybe more, 70% were married by the age of 30. And then it decreases until you get to the Millennials, where about 25% are married by the age of 30. And I would expect that many of them will never get married. So across a whole set of measures, if you look at these empirical set of data, shows that what we see is a rise of this kind of experience of being an individual, of wanting to stay unconnected, disconnected, keeping my options open, not involving myself overly in any kind of commitments that might sort of limit my sense of individual autonomy and independence. I think that, and when I showed my students this data, and these are Catholic students, these Notre Dame students, they looked at this and they said, yeah, and that's us. That's who we are. Right? And they'll stay, most of them will probably stay within the church. I think that's one of the things we do relatively well. But they'll tell me frankly they don't agree with a lot of what the church has to say. So they'll stay in the church and they'll go to mass, but their membership will be, conditional. So I think we're seeing a kind of unfolding of a phenomenon that Tocqueville describes and worries about, and we can't assume that what has been a traditional and historical strength within America will simply stay that way against, I think, these countervailing forces that I think we see unfolding in the way that Tocqueville feared.
Thank you, Doctor.
Yeah.
If you go to Holland, Michigan, and go around to the Ottawa Beach, you'll see a big lighthouse. It doesn't look like any other lighthouse in America. It's not round, it's square. It's bright red. And they will all point it out, they all know why it's like that. And it's because when the Dutch community first came to this country, they realized that they had to get a clear channel out to the lake to get their produce to Chicago. And they petitioned the government, and the government said, well, we've got a lot of other lighthouses to build. So they built their own. And that's, I say that's when they became Americans. They they did that. And it's still like that. I don't think it's really I think it's probably an historical site now, but boy, they don't want to get rid of it. That's them. So
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you, Pat. Doctor, one of the things that occurred to me while you were talking...
You're also formal.
Yeah. Well, I'm of that age.
The silent generation.
Exactly. As you were talking, it occurred to me that de Tocqueville came from a time and a place on the continent when there was a raging debate about what form of politics would best serve the people. And on one hand, there were the traditionalists who wanted to go back to the aristocratic, limited kingship, limited by intermediary institutions that were prominent, like the church, for instance, or guilds, or things like that. Then the other complete opposite of that was the egalitarian Democrats, who really were socialist, who envisioned this completely equal society. And then the middle ground was this bourgeois democracy in which the moneyed class would kind of control the politics. So the question occurred to me as I was listening to you, how much of that debate informed de Tocqueville's observations of America? Because this is a democracy that was down a track much further than even in England was going. How much did that inform his observations, either in terms of seeing contrast between that vision or confirmations, that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the really fine books on Tocqueville is a book by a political theorist named Sheldon Wolin called Tocqueville Between Two Worlds, and I think that accurately captures Tocqueville in a lot of ways. And not only is he between two worlds in the sense that he travels between France and America, so he's kind of living in between, but he was between two worlds in the sense that while he came from an aristocratic family and an aristocratic background, he was not drawn to, in some ways, being what was then called a reactionary, and arguing that the old forms were inviolable and ought to be retained at any cost. He saw, and this is why I think there's a power to his analysis that remains today. He saw the costs and the downside of aristocracy. So what I'm relating to you today, in many ways, he wants to remind us of the things that we should retain, or at least think about retaining, that can be thought to be in some ways vestiges of an aristocratic society. But he wasn't arguing that we just need to go back. That's not where he stands. On the other hand, he also saw the costs and the downsides of a democratic world that was aborning. So I think what he was essentially trying to do was make an argument, and this is what I was trying to draw out tonight, for how one can imagine the possibility of retaining certain kinds of what I've been calling here, what Tocqueville calls forms, within a democratic age. Or how can one think about retaining certain kinds of almost either intellectual inheritances, aristocratic inheritances that democracies could not themselves create, retaining them, or either creating or retaining aspects that could be thought to be in some ways kinds of forms that would be compatible with democracy. And here, particular associations are one example of a kind of, kind of form. People coming together and doing things together. In a sense, what he was trying to say is it possible for a democratic society to have and retain various kinds of forms within it, such that it can resist the tendency of what he sees as the great danger, which is to only have, in some ways, 2 points by which we can understand sort of the ontological reality of humanity. And those 2 points are either the reality of the individual, on the one hand, or the reality of the state, on the other. Now, in our time, in our political debate, if you were to simply follow the debates that you see unfold every 4 years in the presidential elections, you might think that the political debate in America today is between those who believe in the inviolability and the ultimate defensibility of the individual and those who are statist. And I won't tell you which parties represent which. You can draw your own conclusions. What Tocqueville argues is that you are deceived if you think these are the options, because these are 2 mutually reinforcing ontological realities. That it is a society filled with people who believe they are radically autonomous selves that will become the most statist society, that will become the most centralized society. In that last chapter on democratic despotism, one of the things he says is that a society of radically individuated selves will have nowhere else to turn for assistance. If you want to build the lighthouse, who's going to build it? Not the radically autonomous selves. You go to Washington. So we need a lighthouse. Help us build a lighthouse. Taxes? Okay, well, we'll pay taxes. Right. It's a society of radically individuated selves that's going to become the most centralized society. I think we saw a piece of evidence for this, my favorite piece of cultural evidence for this. I don't know if you saw this when President Obama ran for re-election. I don't mean to be partisan and pick on President Obama, but why not? I don't know if you saw this piece of political advertising that made a brief appearance only on the internet called The Life of Julia. Anyone see this? This is really remarkable. It was a campaign ad, came out of the Obama presidential funds, that portrayed the life of a woman named Julia, and every woman who we were to understand who had a very fulfilling, full life because of all the various government programs that had been sponsored by President Obama and other administrations that helped her and assisted her in becoming a fully individuated self. And what was remarkable about these set of slides that followed Julia from her elementary school till the point of her death was that it was a world depopulated, a world without other human beings, in which apparently everything that she became and everything that made her life possible was a result of a government program, and that she never had to rely on any actual human being. There's one slide in which she has a child. We don't know where that child came from. And all we see is that child getting on a school bus and being taken away. So as far as we know, that little child never reappears again. It's kind of sad. But that child has nothing to do with helping take care of her when she grows old. And it seems to be the case that the government programs allow her to be relatively free of that child. So what this advertisement portrayed was a perfectly individuated self who was allowed to become perfectly individuated by means of a set of government programs. Now, of course, we could be asked the question, well, how did those government programs come into existence? Doesn't she owe somebody at some point? Well, presumably, but she doesn't have to have any actual obligation to any actual human beings, and that's the point. This is the homogenization and standardization of which Tocqueville predicted and feared. So the idea that the fundamental political debate within American society is between those who stand for the Ayn Randian individual on the one hand and those who stand for the goodness and beneficence of the state on the other, Tocqueville will regard this as the perfect embodiment of where democracy is going to go. And if you think this is the actual political debate, you've been sort of had one put over on you, because all that results from that is a kind of mutually reinforcing set of dynamics. What Tocqueville then argues is that if you're going to retain a healthy democratic society, do it yourselves. Be in a position to build your own lighthouse. Be in a position to gather people together to help each other out when people fall on hard times. And I think, if we face a world in which I think we are facing a world in which we collectively, not you, but we collectively are raising a generation of young people who apparently will have no associational life, or very minimal associational life. We're going to need a true counterculture to combat that. And it's going to have to be a counterculture that exists and I think will be fostered within institutions like the Catholic Church. Because I don't think there are not many places today in our society that have resisted this tendency toward a deformalization of life. We're done? Okay. I could keep going all night. Thank you.